Most people spend more time researching a car purchase than they spend understanding the actual science of what they are attracted to, why they fall in love with specific people, and what genuinely predicts whether a romantic relationship will last. And the consequence of that knowledge gap is everywhere you look. Divorce rates that have hovered around 50% for decades, millions of people spending years on dating apps, selecting for criteria that have almost no relationship to long-term compatibility. Partnerships that begin with extraordinary chemistry and end in chronic conflict or quiet misery. And the tragedy in almost all of those cases is not that the people involved were incapable of successful relationships. It is that they were operating on intuitions, cultural scripts, and advice from friends that had no grounding in what the research actually shows. Today, we are going to change that. Welcome to the Huberman Lab podcast, where we discuss science and science-based tools for everyday life. I am Andrew Huberman, and I am a professor of neurobiology and ophthalmology at Stanford School of Medicine. Today's episode covers the science of attraction, compatibility, and romantic relationships. And I want to be honest with you about what that means and what it does not mean. The science of human romantic behavior is real, it is rigorous in the best cases, and it is genuinely illuminating. But it is also a field that deals with enormous individual variation, with cultural context that shapes behavior in ways that interact with biology and with the irreducible complexity of two specific human beings encountering each other at a specific moment in their lives. So I am going to give you the science as clearly and as honestly as I can, and I am going to be precise about where the findings are robust and where they are more preliminary or contested. What I will not do is reduce human romantic love to a simple formula, because the science does not support that, and neither does the honest lived experience of anyone who has been in a real relationship. Here is the roadmap for today. We are going to start with the neurobiology and psychology of attraction, including what people actually look for in potential partners and where those preferences come from. We are going to cover some genuinely surprising findings about age preferences, financial considerations, and the role of physical attractiveness that are more nuanced than popular culture suggests. We are going to spend significant time on dating apps because they have become the dominant way people meet romantic partners in many parts of the world. And the research on how they work and what they do to our psychology and our mate selection is fascinating and at times quite alarming. We are going to cover the early formation of attraction and what happens in the brain during the initial stages of romantic interest and falling in love. And then we are going to get into the most practically valuable part of today's episode, which is the science of what actually predicts long-term relationship satisfaction and stability, and the specific tools and practices that support healthy, enduring partnerships. Before we dive in, let me briefly mention our sponsors. Sponsor mention AG1. I take AG1 every morning as my foundational nutritional supplement, covering vitamins, minerals, adaptogens, and probiotics in a single serving. Go to drinkag1.com/Huberman to get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D3 plus K2 with your first order. Sponsor mention 8 Sleep. Sleep quality has direct effects on emotional regulation, social cognition, and the interpersonal behaviors that matter enormously in relationships. 8 Sleep's pod mattress cover automatically adjusts your sleep surface temperature throughout the night. Visit 8sleep.com/Huberman to learn more. Sponsor mention LMNT. Proper hydration and electrolyte balance support every aspect of brain and body function, including the social and emotional processing we will be discussing today. Go to drinklmnt.com/Huberman for a free sample pack with any order. Without further ado, let's dive in. I want to start with the neurobiology of attraction because I think it is genuinely important to understand what is happening in the brain when you feel attracted to someone and how those feelings differ from what happens when you fall in love with someone and from the experience of long-term attachment. These are not the same states. They involve different neurochemical systems, different brain regions, and they unfold on different timescales. And understanding that distinction is one of the most practically useful things I can offer you in this episode. The neuroscientist Helen Fisher, who has spent decades studying the biology of romantic love, has proposed a framework that distinguishes 3 overlapping but distinct systems: lust, attraction or romantic love, and attachment. Lust is driven primarily by the sex, steroids, testosterone, and estrogen, and is broadly motivational towards sexual activity without necessarily being directed at a specific individual. It is the generalized drive state that orients attention and behavior towards sexual opportunity. Attraction, what Fisher calls romantic love, is a far more focused state. It is characterized by craving for a specific individual, intrusive thoughts about that person, elevated energy, reduced need for sleep, and a kind of goal-directed urgency. The neurochemistry here is dominated by dopamine, particularly through circuits in the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens, which together form the core of the mesolimbic reward system. Dopamine is released when we encounter rewarding stimuli and, critically, when we anticipate reward. It is what makes reward motivating, not just pleasant. And the reason romantic love has the addictive craving quality that it does is that it is activating the same reward circuitry that is involved in all highly motivated behavior and in addiction. Research from Fisher's group and others using functional MRI has shown that people who report being in the early stages of romantic love show activation in dopaminergic reward circuits when shown a photograph of their beloved that is similar in magnitude to the activation seen in drug reward studies. This is not a metaphor. The neurological parallels between early romantic love and addiction are genuine, and they explain why rejection in love is so devastating, why people do irrational things for love, and why the early passionate phase of a relationship has a quality of intensity that can feel overwhelming. The third system, attachment, is primarily driven by the neuropeptides oxytocin and vasopressin. These molecules are released during physical touch, during sex, during shared experiences, and in the context of long-term familiarity. They promote bonding, a sense of calm and security with a specific person, and the preference for proximity to that person over others. The attachment system is what sustains relationships after the initial intensity of early romantic love naturally diminishes, and it diminishes in almost every relationship. The research consistently shows that the elevated dopaminergic state of early passionate love typically lasts somewhere between 6 months and 2 years before settling into a less intensely activated baseline. This is not a failure of the relationship. It is the normal biological trajectory of the transition from the early passionate phase to what researchers call companionate love, which is characterized by deep affection, comfort, security, and strong mutual attachment rather than the consuming urgency of early romance. Knowing this trajectory is enormously valuable for people in relationships because a very common relationship error is interpreting the natural decline in early passionate intensity as evidence that something has gone wrong, that you have fallen out of love, or that the relationship has run its course. Understanding the biology helps you recognize that transition for what it is and to build toward the companionate love that research shows is actually more predictive of long-term happiness than the passionate early phase. Now let me talk about what people actually look for in romantic partners, because this is an area where the research has produced some findings that are genuinely surprising and that challenge both popular assumptions and some earlier scientific claims. The classic framework in evolutionary psychology holds that mate preferences are substantially driven by evolutionary pressures. Men, the framework goes, evolve to prioritize physical attractiveness and cues to fertility in potential mates. Women evolve to prioritize resources, status, and the capacity for parental investment. This framework, associated particularly with the work of David Buss, captured significant research attention beginning in the late 1980s and generated a body of findings that are real, but that have been substantially qualified and complicated by more recent research. Let me be precise about what the current evidence shows. Physical attractiveness matters in mate selection, and it matters for both men and women more than many people are comfortable acknowledging. A meta-analysis published in the journal Psychological Bulletin, examining studies across multiple cultures, found that physical attractiveness is a significant predictor of mate selection behavior in both sexes, though the effect size is somewhat larger for men evaluating women than for women evaluating men. This is consistent with the evolutionary framework, but the magnitude of the sex difference is smaller than popular narratives suggest, and it is importantly modulated by other factors, including the format of the interaction, the information available, and the time spent together And I want to be careful here to distinguish between what people say they want and what they actually respond to behaviorally, because those two things diverge in interesting ways that the research has documented. When asked in surveys what qualities they prioritize in a partner, both men and women rank kindness, intelligence, and emotional availability highly. When their actual behavior in dating contexts is measured, physical attractiveness plays a larger role than their stated preferences would predict. Age preferences in mate selection are another area where the evidence is more nuanced than simple evolutionary narratives suggest. The evolutionary framework predicts that men will prefer younger women because youth is correlated with fertility. The data does show this as a statistical tendency in many cultural contexts, but the research by Elizabeth Brooke and Mark Newman, published in Science Advances, analyzing the messaging behavior of millions of users across a major American dating platform, found that the age preferences people actually act on are substantially more flexible than evolutionary psychology would predict, and that they are heavily influenced by social norms, personal experience, and the specific dating context. Women showed a preference for men somewhat older than themselves on average, but the range of preferences was broad and the mean age difference preferred was modest. And crucially, both men's and women's actual messaging behavior reflected more pragmatic considerations than pure attractiveness optimization, including responding to people who showed genuine interest, who shared interests, and who communicated well. Financial considerations in mate selection are genuinely more complex than either cynical or idealistic accounts suggest. The research shows that financial resources and earning potential are considered relevant by both men and women when evaluating long-term partnership potential, though more so by women evaluating men than the reverse. This is one of the more replicable findings in the cross-cultural mate preference literature, but the interpretation of that finding requires care. Financial security as a preference is not simply about access to resources in a materialistic sense. It also correlates with personality traits, including conscientiousness, industriousness, and future orientation that are themselves associated with partnership quality. And importantly, the research by David Buss and his collaborators on actual mate selection rather than stated preferences finds that financial status has diminishing importance relative to personality and character factors when relationships are evaluated over longer time frames. People may select partly on financial criteria, but the financial variable becomes less predictive of relationship satisfaction than personality, compatibility, attachment style, and communication quality as relationships mature. Sponsor break, 1 to 2 minutes. Let me now talk about dating apps specifically, because I think this deserves extended treatment given how fundamentally they have changed the landscape of human mate selection. The statistics on dating apps are staggering. Depending on the study in the country, somewhere between 30 and 40% of new romantic relationships in the United States now begin online, with dating apps being the primary vehicle. This represents a complete transformation of the social context in which people form romantic connections in less than 15 years. And the research on what this transformation has done to the psychology of mate selection is genuinely important and sometimes troubling. The fundamental design of most dating apps involves rapid assessment of potential partners based primarily on a small number of photographs and a brief profile. You see someone's photos, perhaps read a few lines about them, and make a decision, often in under a second, about whether to swipe right or left. The interface is optimized for speed, volume, and visual assessment. And the research shows that this format systematically biases mate selection toward a narrow set of factors while suppressing the factors that are most predictive of actual compatibility and relationship success. The psychologist Eli Finkel at Northwestern University, who has studied online dating extensively and whose work I consider among the most important in this space, has made a distinction between things that are easily evaluated online versus things that can only be evaluated in person over time. Things that are easily evaluated online include physical appearance, stated demographics, listed interests, and presented identity. Things that are very poorly evaluated online or not evaluable at all include actual physical chemistry, the felt sense of comfort and ease in someone's presence, humor as it actually lands in real time, warmth and responsiveness in a genuine conversation, how someone treats other people, how they handle frustration or disappointment, and what it actually feels like to spend time with them. The problem is that the factors that are easily evaluated online overlap poorly with the factors that predict long-term compatibility. Physical appearance, which is the primary driver of swipe behavior on virtually all dating apps, has a relatively modest correlation with long-term relationship satisfaction compared to factors like personality, similarity, values alignment, attachment style, and emotional intelligence. You are making decisions primarily based on the thing that matters least for long-term happiness. There is a second problem with dating apps that I think is equally significant and that I want to make sure we address carefully. Dating apps create what economists would call a market structure for human romantic selection. And markets have specific dynamics that do not map well onto the dynamics of human bonding. In a market, you compare options, you assess alternatives, you optimize your choice. These cognitive processes are appropriate for buying a car. They are actively counterproductive in the context of romantic relationships. The research by Barry Schwartz on the paradox of choice and its application to romantic contexts shows that when people are presented with a large number of potential romantic options, they become less satisfied with their ultimate choices, more prone to regret, and more likely to continue evaluating alternatives even after selecting a partner. The abundance of apparent options that dating apps create does not make people better at choosing partners. It makes them worse because it promotes a consumerist orientation toward potential partners that is incompatible with the vulnerability, commitment, and investment that successful romantic relationships require. There is also evidence that the quantification that dating apps impose, the visible metrics of matches, the ranking algorithms, the experience of being evaluated and accepting or rejecting others at volume, affects self-perception and social comparison in ways that are not benign. Research published in the journal Body Image has shown that frequent use of Tinder, the largest swipe-based dating app, is associated with lower self-esteem, higher levels of body shame and appearance comparison, and more negative mood in both men and women. This makes sense mechanistically. If you use an interface where you are evaluated as an object by thousands of strangers whose judgments you will never fully understand, and where the feedback you receive is binary, accepted, or rejected, without the context and nuance that real social interactions provide, the psychological effects on self-concept would not be expected to be positive. None of this is an argument that dating apps are inherently harmful or that meeting someone online cannot lead to a good relationship. Clearly it can and does. It is an argument that the specific design of most current dating apps creates structural biases in how we evaluate potential partners that work against the selection of compatible long-term partners. Being aware of these biases is the first step in not being controlled by them. Practically, this means a few things. If you use dating apps, treat them as a mechanism for meeting people rather than for selecting people. The selection should happen in person over time in real interactions that allow you to assess the things that actually matter. Move from online interaction to in-person meeting relatively quickly, rather than investing heavily in texting conversations that create an illusion of intimacy without the real-world data that in-person time provides. And be genuinely suspicious of any preference that feels like you have formed a strong opinion about someone based primarily on their profile. That opinion is based on the things that matter least. Now I want to talk about the actual formation of attraction in the early stages of a relationship, because the research here is both fascinating and directly actionable. One of the most important and most robust findings in the social psychology of attraction is the mere exposure effect. The mere exposure effect, documented in hundreds of studies since the original work of Robert Zajonc in 1968, is the phenomenon whereby repeated exposure to a stimulus increases liking for that stimulus. In the context of romantic attraction, this means that repeated encounters with a specific person, even without any notable events during those encounters, increases the probability that you will find that person attractive and likable. The evolutionary logic is straightforward. Familiarity predicts safety. Novel stimuli carry uncertain risk. Over evolutionary time, developing positive feelings toward familiar individuals rather than unfamiliar ones would have been adaptive. The practical implication for modern romantic behavior is significant. The context in which romantic relationships most naturally form, the workplace, shared classes, neighborhood proximity, repeated social circles, are contexts that create repeated exposure. Dating apps do the opposite. They create single encounters with strangers in an artificial context and expect romantic attraction to ignite without the natural foundation that repeated exposure builds. This is not impossible, but it is working against one of the most powerful natural mechanisms of attraction development. Related to this is the research on propinquity, which is a term from the social psychology literature that refers to physical proximity as a predictor of relationship formation. Studies dating back to the 1950s, including classic work by Festinger, Schachter, and Back on Housing Patterns in Married Student Housing at MIT, showed that the closer people lived to each other, the more likely they were to form friendships and romantic relationships. The mechanism is partly mere exposure and partly the reduced friction that proximity provides for the kind of repeated casual interaction that allows relationships to develop naturally. The practical implication is that proximity matters more than most people recognize when thinking about how to meet potential partners. Regularly attended activities, classes, clubs, neighborhood events, and workplaces are all high propinquity contexts that naturally support attraction development. This is not an argument to never use dating apps. It is an argument for giving appropriate weight to relationship opportunities that arise naturally in high propinquity contexts, which people in a dating app era sometimes dismiss in favor of the illusion of optimized selection that apps provide. Physical attractiveness cues are worth going deeper on because the research here is more complicated than the simple hierarchy that popular culture presents. Studies of what specific physical features drive attractiveness ratings show some cross-cultural consistency, including preferences for facial symmetry, which is thought to reflect developmental stability and genetic quality, preferences for certain waist-to-hip ratios, which differ between men and women in ways that reflect sex-specific signaling about health and fertility, and preferences for clear skin and lustrous hair, which may serve as cues to health status. But what is often underemphasized is how dramatically context and self-perception modulate these responses. Research has shown that people are rated as more attractive when they are in a good mood, when they are with a group of attractive people, when they have just received positive social feedback, and when the rater is in a high arousal emotional state. The research by Arthur Aaron on the misattribution of arousal, including the famous bridge study in which people crossing a high suspension bridge showed greater romantic interest in an attractive interviewer than people crossing a low stable bridge, illustrates how emotional arousal from unrelated sources can be attributed to romantic interest in a person who happens to be present. This has a direct practical implication. Activities and dates that involve mild physiological arousal, novelty, or even mild fear tend to produce more intense romantic feelings than low arousal activities. Trying new restaurants, attending live performances, taking a dance class, going to a comedy show, participating in physically active experiences together, all of these create arousal states that can facilitate romantic bonding in ways that a standard dinner in a familiar environment does not. Sponsor break, 2 to 2 minutes. I want to now move into what I consider the most important section of today's episode, which is the science of what actually predicts long-term relationship satisfaction and stability. Because the factors that attract people to each other are, in many respects, different from the factors that determine whether a relationship is genuinely good over years and decades. And understanding that distinction is probably the most practically valuable insight I can offer on this topic. The most robust and well-replicated predictor of long-term relationship quality that the research has produced comes not from personality, psychology, or evolutionary biology, but from the work of John Gottman. Gottman, who spent 4 decades studying couples at the University of Washington, developed the capacity to predict with remarkably high accuracy whether couples would divorce or stay together based on observing their interactions for relatively short periods of time. His research identified what he calls the Four Horsemen of relationship deterioration And I want to cover each of these in detail because the research behind them is extraordinarily robust and because recognizing these patterns is the first step toward changing them. The first horseman is criticism. Gottman distinguishes carefully between a complaint and a criticism. A complaint addresses a specific behavior. You forgot to call me and I was worried. A criticism attacks the character of the partner. You always forget things. You are so irresponsible. The distinction matters because complaints are solvable. They point to a behavior that can be changed. Criticisms are attacks on identity that trigger defensiveness and escalation. The research shows that couples in which criticism is a regular communication pattern show significantly elevated rates of relationship dissolution. The antidote to criticism that Gottman identifies is the gentle startup, which means raising concerns by beginning with your own feelings in a specific situation rather than with a characterization of the other person. The second horseman is contempt, which Gottman's research identifies as the single most powerful predictor of relationship dissolution and of physical health deterioration in partners. Contempt is the communication of moral superiority. It can be expressed through sarcasm, mockery, eye-rolling, dismissive sighs, or any behavior that conveys that you find your partner fundamentally inferior or beneath you. Contempt is different from anger. Anger says, I care about this and I am upset. Contempt says, you are not worthy of my care. Research from Gottman's lab has shown that couples who express contempt toward each other experience more severe physiological stress responses during conflict, which over years predicts deteriorating physical health outcomes for both partners. The antidote to contempt is the development of a culture of appreciation, which means actively building the habit of noticing and expressing what you value and appreciate in your partner on a daily basis. The third horseman is defensiveness, which typically arises as a response to criticism or contempt, but which functions as an escalation rather than a resolution. Defensiveness says, you are wrong and I am right, and typically involves counterattack or victim playing. It prevents the resolution of the underlying concern and cycles the conflict upward in intensity. The antidote to defensiveness is accepting responsibility for your part in a situation, even a small part, which de-escalates the interaction and signals to your partner that you are hearing them. The fourth horseman is stonewalling, which is emotional withdrawal from the interaction. The stonewaller stops responding, gives monosyllabic answers, or physically withdraws. It typically occurs when a person has become so physiologically flooded by the conflict that they cannot continue engaging. Research by Gottman and Robert Levinson on physiological measures during couple conflict showed that stonewalling is almost always preceded by and associated with elevated heart rate, above 100 beats per minute in many cases, and that when people are in that physiological state, they genuinely cannot process information effectively or engage in productive conflict resolution. The antidote is physiological self-soothing, which means taking a break of at least 20 minutes from the conflict to allow the nervous system to return to baseline with an explicit agreement to return to the discussion rather than using the break as a permanent exit from the conversation. Gottman's research found that stable, happy couples are not couples who do not fight. They are couples who fight without using the Four Horsemen as their primary communication style. In happy, stable relationships, conflicts exist, but they are navigated with what Gottman calls gentle startup, with attempts to de-escalate, with acceptance of influence from the partner, and with physiological awareness of when the conversation needs to pause. This is teachable. These are learnable communication patterns, and there is substantial research showing that couples who engage in structured communication skills training show meaningful improvements in relationship quality. The work of attachment theory is the second major scientific framework that I consider essential for understanding romantic relationships. Attachment theory was originally developed by the British psychiatrist John Bowlby to describe the bond between infants and their primary caregivers. Mary Ainsworth's subsequent research on infant attachment patterns identified secure attachment, characterized by confidence in the caregiver's availability, and two primary forms of insecure attachment, anxious attachment, characterized by heightened distress when the caregiver is unavailable, and avoidant attachment, characterized by apparent indifference to the caregiver's presence or absence as a defensive adaptation to unreliable caregiving. Hazan and Shaver in 1987 proposed that these same attachment patterns operate in adult romantic relationships, and the subsequent decades of research on adult attachment have been one of the most productive areas in relationship psychology. Adults with secure attachment styles, roughly 50 to 60% of the population, depending on the study and the measurement method, tend to be comfortable with intimacy and interdependence, confident that their partners are available and responsive, and effective at communicating their needs. They tend to have longer, more satisfying relationships and recover more effectively from relationship difficulties. Adults with anxious attachment styles, roughly 20% of the population, have a heightened sensitivity to perceived threats to the relationship. They may interpret ambiguous partner behavior as rejection, become preoccupied with the relationship, have difficulty self-soothing during conflict, and show elevated distress when the partner is unavailable. Adults with avoidant attachment styles, roughly 25%, tend to suppress awareness of attachment needs, become uncomfortable with intimacy and dependence, pull away when relationships become close, and minimize the importance of the relationship during periods of stress. A fourth pattern, disorganized or fearful avoidant attachment, occurs in a smaller proportion of adults and is associated with both a desire for and a fear of closeness, often arising from early experiences of caregiving that were also frightening. The clinical relevance of attachment styles is significant for several reasons. First, attachment style is a meaningful predictor of relationship satisfaction and stability. Secure attachment is associated with significantly better outcomes across a range of relationship measures. Second, attachment styles are not completely fixed. They are patterns that developed in response to early experience, and that can be modified through therapeutic work, through secure relationships, and through specific behavioral practice. A person with an anxious attachment style is not condemned to anxious attachment forever. Earned security, which is the process by which people develop secure functioning through new positive relationship experiences and through deliberate work on self-awareness and emotional regulation, is real and documented. Third, attachment style pairing matters. The most common and most challenging pairing is anxious avoidant, sometimes called the pursuer-withdrawer dynamic. The anxious partner perceives distance and escalates their bids for connection. The avoidant partner feels intruded upon and withdraws further. The withdrawal triggers more escalation from the anxious partner, which triggers more withdrawal in a cycle that can escalate to relationship crisis. Understanding this dynamic is enormously useful for couples caught in it, because the intervention is not about one person being right and the other wrong, but about both people understanding their own patterns and working together to interrupt the cycle. Now I want to address the question of similarity versus complementarity in romantic partnerships, because popular culture has held both beliefs simultaneously without fully examining what the evidence shows. The idea that opposites attract has romantic appeal but poor empirical support. Research consistently shows that similarity in values, in personality traits, especially the big five personality dimensions, in interests, in communication style, and in life goals predicts greater relationship satisfaction than complementarity. The largest and most methodologically sophisticated study of this question, published in Nature Human Behavior by Tomas Chamorro-Premuzic and collaborators using a very large data set, found robust evidence for similarity effects across multiple domains, including personality, values, and interests. The similarity does not need to be total, and similarity on every dimension is not the goal. But the data strongly suggests that people who share fundamental values, who have similar approaches to life, and who are at comparable levels of emotional maturity and psychological development tend to build more satisfying relationships than those who are highly dissimilar. There is one area where complementarity does appear to operate in relationships, and that is in the domain of certain specific trait combinations. Research on assertiveness and agreeableness, for example, suggests that some mismatch in these traits within a couple can work well functionally, with one partner being more directive and one more accommodating. But even here, the overall profile of value and personality similarity remains the stronger predictor of relationship satisfaction than trait complementarity. values alignment deserves particular emphasis because I think it is genuinely underweighted in how people evaluate potential partners. When I say values, I mean the fundamental beliefs about how to live, about what matters, about family and work and leisure and money and religion or its absence, about how conflict should be handled, about what loyalty and commitment mean. Research shows that couples who discover significant value misalignments after forming a relationship frequently experience those misalignments as irresolvable conflicts, precisely because values operate at a different level than preferences or habits. You can negotiate about who does the dishes or where to go on vacation. It is much harder to negotiate about whether to have children, about fundamentally different relationships to money, or about incompatible visions of what a good life looks like. The research on what topics most commonly drive relationship dissolution points consistently to these deeper value incompatibilities. This suggests that the investment people make in evaluating values alignment early in a relationship, before emotional attachment deepens and the cost of ending the relationship rises, is very well spent. Let me now talk about the practical tools for building and sustaining healthy romantic relationships, because everything I have said so far is most valuable when it connects to specific, actionable behaviors. The first tool comes directly from Arthur Aaron's research on relational closeness. Aaron and his colleagues published a paper in 1997 titled The Experimental Generation of Interpersonal Closeness, in which they showed that pairs of strangers who took turns answering a series of 36 progressively personal questions and then spent 4 minutes gazing into each other's eyes reported significantly greater feelings of closeness afterward than control pairs who engaged in small talk. One of the pairs from the original study later married. The questions, which became widely known as the 36 questions that lead to love, are structured to produce gradually escalating self-disclosure and reciprocal vulnerability. They start with relatively low-stakes questions and move toward progressively more personal ones. The mechanism behind why this works involves what psychologists call the self-disclosure reciprocity norm, which is the tendency to match the level of personal disclosure that the other person offers. When someone shares something vulnerable, we are cued to reciprocate, and mutual vulnerability is one of the primary mechanisms through which closeness develops. The practical tool here is the intentional use of progressive self-disclosure in both the early stages of a relationship to build genuine closeness faster than small talk allows, and in established relationships where the natural entropy of routine can cause partners to stop sharing in the ways that originally built their connection. The second tool is what Gottman calls the magic ratio. His research found that in stable, happy couples, the ratio of positive to negative interactions is approximately 5-1. For every criticism, complaint, or moment of conflict, there are roughly 5 moments of positive connection: appreciation, humor, affection, or interest. This ratio does not mean that conflict is unimportant or that it should be suppressed. It means that the ongoing background of positive interaction is what provides the relational foundation from which conflicts can be navigated without becoming destabilizing. The practical implication is that building the positive is as important as, and in some respects more important than, reducing the negative. Relationships are not primarily managed by reducing conflict. They are built by consistently adding to the positive balance, expressing appreciation daily, asking genuine questions about your partner's experiences, making small bids for connection and responding to your partner's bids, physical affection, humor and play. All of these are deposits in the emotional bank account that provides resilience during the inevitable withdrawals of conflict and stress. The third tool is the practice of what Gottman calls turning toward rather than turning away. Bids for connection are the small verbal and nonverbal attempts that partners make to establish contact throughout the day. These can be explicit, let's talk about our week, or very subtle, a comment about something outside the window, or a sigh during a difficult moment. Research from the Gottman Institute's Love Lab found that couples who stay together and report high relationship satisfaction respond to each other's bids for connection with turning toward, meaning they acknowledge the bid and respond to it, at rates of approximately 86%. Couples who later divorced showed turning toward rates of approximately 33%. The bids are often small and easy to miss, particularly when attention is consumed by phones, work, or other distractions. The practice of developing awareness of your partner's bids and making a habit of turning toward them is one of the highest leverage relational behaviors the research identifies. The fourth tool addresses the expansion of your dating pool, which is something I want to address practically for people who are looking for a partner. The research on propinquity and mere exposure that I described earlier suggests a clear framework. The highest value activities for meeting a potential partner are repeated, structured activities in which you encounter the same people multiple times over weeks and months, where shared interest or purpose is already established, and where natural conversation occurs as part of the activity. Classes of all kinds, from fitness to art to language to cooking, regular volunteer commitments, sports teams and recreational leagues, professional and professional interest groups, book clubs and intellectual discussion groups, religious and spiritual communities. All of these create the repeated exposure and natural social context that research shows most strongly support attraction development. They are also self-selecting environments in which the people you meet have already demonstrated at least one relevant shared interest, which is a better filter for compatibility than the algorithmically generated matches of a dating app. The data from the study I mentioned by Bruce and Newman and from additional research on relationship formation across meeting contexts consistently shows that couples who met in these organic, repeated exposure contexts report higher relationship quality than those who met through purely digital matching, even after controlling for other factors. A specific note on the role of novelty and arousal-generating activities in early relationship formation that builds directly on the misattribution of arousal research I described earlier. The data suggests that dates or early encounters that involve genuine novelty, mild risk, or physiological arousal produce stronger initial feelings of attraction than low arousal encounters. This is a concrete, actionable, evidence-based suggestion for how to structure early romantic encounters. Do something new together. Go somewhere neither of you has been. Try an activity that involves some learning curve or mild challenge. The shared arousal state, the shared novelty, and the natural interdependence that unfamiliar situations create all serve to accelerate the bonding process relative to a familiar low arousal setting. For established relationships, the research by Aaron on self-expansion theory is particularly relevant. Self-expansion theory holds that one of the fundamental motivations in human behavior is the desire to expand the self, to acquire new perspectives, resources, identities, and capabilities. Early romantic love naturally provides enormous self-expansion because your partner introduces you to new people, new ideas, new experiences, and a new perspective on yourself through their eyes. Over time, as the relationship becomes familiar and the novelty decreases, the self-expansion that the relationship provides decreases with it, and this contributes to the decrease in relationship satisfaction that many couples experience. The research-supported antidote is to deliberately continue introducing novelty and new experiences into the relationship. Doing new things together, not just doing more of things you already do, maintains the self-expansive quality of the relationship and the heightened positive affect and attraction associated with it. Aaron's experimental research, in which couples were randomly assigned to either novel and exciting activities or familiar and pleasant activities for 10 weeks, showed significantly greater improvements in relationship satisfaction in the novel activity group, confirming that novelty is not just pleasant, but specifically relationally beneficial. Let me address the sexual dimension of long-term relationships because it would be a significant omission to discuss relationship science without acknowledging its role. The research on sexual satisfaction in long-term relationships and its relationship to overall relationship quality is clear and sobering. Sexual satisfaction and relationship satisfaction are strongly correlated in both directions. Good relationships tend to support sexual satisfaction, and sexual satisfaction supports relationship quality. The research by Emily Nagoski, whose work on sexual response is excellent, and by others, has shown that sexual desire exists in two forms: spontaneous desire, which arises without specific stimulus, and responsive desire, which emerges in response to arousal or engagement. In new relationships, spontaneous desire is typically high for both partners due to the novelty and dopaminergic activation of early romantic love. Over time, spontaneous desire naturally decreases and responsive desire becomes more important. Couples who understand this and who prioritize creating conditions for responsive desire through deliberate prioritization of sexual intimacy, even when spontaneous desire is not present, through maintaining physical affection as a regular presence in the relationship, and through open communication about sexual needs and preferences, tend to maintain greater sexual satisfaction than couples who rely exclusively on spontaneous desire and who interpret its decline as a problem of the relationship. The data on frequency of sex and relationship satisfaction shows an interesting pattern. Relationship quality improves with sexual frequency up to approximately once per week, beyond which additional frequency shows no further improvement in self-reported relationship satisfaction for most couples. This finding, from research by Amy Muis and colleagues published in Social Psychological and Personality Science, suggests that the minimum effective dose for sexual intimacy in a relationship is lower than many people assume, and that quality, meaning the felt connection and mutual satisfaction of sexual encounters, matters substantially more than quantity. Let me close with what I consider the most important overarching framework from today's episode. Romantic relationships are not found. They are built. The Hollywood model of romantic love, in which a perfect partner exists to be discovered and in which chemistry is the primary guide, is genuinely harmful because it sets people up to be passive consumers of romantic experience rather than active architects of relational quality. The science is very clear that the long-term quality of a romantic relationship has more to do with what both people do on a daily basis, the bids for connection they make and respond to, the appreciation they express, the communication skills they practice, the investment they make in understanding their own and their partner's patterns, than it has to do with the initial chemistry or the compatibility of their personalities measured at the outset. Initial attraction matters, personality compatibility matters, values alignment matters. But these are the starting conditions, not the outcome. The outcome is built over time through behavior. The key takeaways from today's episode: the neurobiology of romantic love involves three distinct systems: lust driven by sex steroids, romantic attraction driven primarily by dopamine and the reward system, and attachment driven by oxytocin and vasopressin. These operate on different timescales, and understanding the natural transition from passionate early love to companionate long-term attachment prevents misinterpreting a normal biological process as a relationship failure. The factors people select for on dating apps, primarily physical appearance and rapid assessments, overlap poorly with the factors that predict long-term relationship satisfaction, including personality compatibility, values alignment, communication quality, and emotional availability. Dating apps are most productively used as mechanisms for meeting people rather than for evaluating them. Repeated exposure, through the mere exposure effect, and proximity, through the propinquity effect, are among the most powerful drivers of attraction development. Organic, repeated exposure social contexts, such as classes, clubs, and shared regular activities, are among the highest value environments for meeting a compatible partner. The Four Horsemen, identified by Gottman, criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling, are the most reliable predictors of relationship dissolution. Their antidotes are learnable communication patterns that meaningfully improve relationship outcomes. Attachment style is a powerful predictor of relationship behavior and satisfaction. Secure attachment supports positive outcomes. Insecure attachment styles are not fixed and can shift toward greater security through deliberate work and positive relationship experience. Similarity, particularly in values, personality, and life goals, predicts relationship satisfaction more strongly than complementarity. The 5-to-1 positivity ratio, the practice of turning toward bids for connection, and the deliberate cultivation of novelty and self-expansion within the relationship are the three most actionable behavioral tools that emerge from the relationship science literature. Sexual satisfaction and relationship satisfaction are mutually reinforcing. Maintaining sexual intimacy through responsive desire rather than depending exclusively on spontaneous desire, and prioritizing quality over frequency is supported by the evidence. All of the studies and researchers mentioned today are linked in the description below. If you found this episode useful, please share it with someone who is navigating a relationship or looking for one. Thank you for your time, and as always, thank you for your interest in science. I want to add a few more areas that I think are important for a complete picture of the science in this space, because the research literature on romantic relationships is genuinely rich, and there are several topics that I covered more briefly than they deserve. The first is the role of emotional intelligence in relationship quality. Emotional intelligence, broadly defined as the capacity to accurately perceive, understand, manage, and use emotions in oneself and in interactions with others, has a strong evidence base as a predictor of relationship satisfaction and longevity. Research by John Mayer, Peter Salovey, and David Caruso, who developed the most carefully validated model of emotional intelligence, has been applied to romantic relationships by a number of researchers with consistent findings. People higher in emotional intelligence show greater capacity to navigate conflict without escalation, greater accuracy in reading their partner's emotional states, and greater flexibility in responding to their partner's needs rather than defaulting to fixed behavioral patterns. They show more effective repair of relationship ruptures, which are the inevitable moments of disconnection, misattunement, or conflict that occur in all relationships. And they demonstrate what researchers call emotional granularity, the ability to distinguish between different emotional states with precision rather than experiencing emotions as a coarse, undifferentiated signal. Emotional granularity matters because someone who can distinguish between feeling anxious about a relationship event and feeling angry about it and feeling hurt by it and feeling disappointed is in a fundamentally better position to communicate those feelings accurately to their partner than someone for whom all those states collapse into a single undifferentiated bad feeling. The good news about emotional intelligence is that unlike general intelligence, which shows relatively modest malleability in adults, emotional intelligence can be meaningfully developed through deliberate practice. The practices that have the best evidence base for developing emotional intelligence in the relationship context include mindfulness, meditation, which improves the capacity to notice and observe emotional states without immediately reacting to them, reflective journaling about emotional experiences, deliberate practice of perspective taking, which means actively trying to understand your partner's internal experience from their point of view rather than from yours, and therapeutic work, particularly forms of therapy that focus on emotional experience and interpersonal patterns, such as emotionally focused therapy, which was developed by Sue Johnson and Les Greenberg, and which has one of the strongest evidence bases of any couples therapy approach. The second area I want to address more fully is the science of conflict resolution in romantic relationships, because this is where I think the practical tools are most immediately applicable and most underutilized. Effective conflict resolution in a relationship does not mean resolving all conflicts to the complete satisfaction of both parties. Research by Gottman found that approximately 69% of the problems that couples in long-term relationships fight about are what he calls perpetual problems, meaning they are rooted in fundamental differences in personality, in needs, or in values that are not resolvable but are manageable. The goal with perpetual problems is not resolution but dialogue, meaning the development of a way of understanding and discussing the difference that does not involve gridlock and that allows both partners to feel heard and respected even though the underlying difference remains. The conflicts that most seriously threaten relationships are not the perpetual problems, but the gridlocked ones, in which one or both partners have become so entrenched in their position that they can no longer move or acknowledge the validity of the other's perspective. The intervention for gridlock that Gottman's research supports involves moving from positions to dreams, which means exploring the underlying personal meanings and deeper life experiences that make each partner's position feel so important to them. Someone who is extremely rigid about financial saving might have an underlying dream about security rooted in experiences of financial insecurity in childhood. Someone who insists on spending freely might have an underlying dream about abundance and generosity rooted in experiences of deprivation. When couples can access and share these deeper layers of meaning, the gridlocked position often becomes more flexible because both partners feel understood at a level that the surface argument could not reach. A specific communication tool that has strong evidence support is the use of what therapy researchers call I statements, particularly in their fully structured form. The complete form of an I statement is, when you do or say this specific behavior, I feel this specific emotion because I think or I interpret it as this. This structure does several things simultaneously. It grounds the conversation in observable behavior rather than character attribution, which reduces defensiveness. It communicates the speaker's emotional experience directly rather than through attack or complaint, which promotes empathy. And it exposes the interpretation that connects the behavior to the emotional response, which gives the partner the opportunity to address or correct that interpretation if it is inaccurate. The research on couples who are trained to use this communication structure consistently shows reductions in conflict escalation and improvements in felt understanding between partners. The third area I want to address is the science of relationship maintenance over long time periods, which I think is actually where the most practically valuable research lives and where popular culture provides the least useful guidance. The popular model of a successful relationship is one in which love sustains the relationship, in which if you love each other enough, the relationship will work. This is genuinely backwards. The research suggests that in the best long-term relationships, the daily practices of connection and care are what sustain and deepen love over time, not the other way around. Love is less a feeling that motivates behavior and more a consequence of specific behaviors performed consistently over time. This reframe is enormously empowering because it means that relationship quality is substantially within your behavioral control rather than being dependent on a feeling that may fluctuate. Research by Robert Sternberg, whose triangular theory of love proposes that love consists of three components: intimacy, passion, and commitment, has been used to analyze how relationships change over time. In the early phase of romantic relationships, passion is high, intimacy is growing rapidly, and commitment is low. In mature, long-term relationships, passion fluctuates and is generally lower than in the early phase. Intimacy is deep and stable, and commitment is high. Sternberg's research suggests that couples who maintain all three components, who work to sustain some level of passion alongside deep intimacy and strong commitment, report greater relationship satisfaction than those who allow passion to simply disappear without attempting to maintain it. The tools for maintaining passion in a long-term relationship overlap substantially with what I described earlier about Aaron's self-expansion research. Novel shared experiences, deliberate physical affection and sexual prioritization, and maintaining separate identities and interests that each partner can bring back to the shared space of the relationship all support the passionate dimension of established love. A particular finding that I want to emphasize because I think it is underappreciated is the importance of how couples celebrate good news. Research by Shelley Gable at the University of California, Santa Barbara, on what she calls capitalization, the process of sharing positive events with others, has shown that how a partner responds to good news is as predictive of relationship quality as how they respond to bad news. Gable identified 4 response styles: active and constructive, which involves enthusiastically engaging with the good news, asking questions, expressing shared joy; passive and constructive, which involves quiet, positive acknowledgement without much engagement; active and destructive, which involves pointing out potential problems or downsides of the positive event; and passive and destructive, which involves ignoring or minimizing the event. Research shows that only the active and constructive response style is associated with relationship satisfaction and trust. The other 3, even the passive and constructive response that seems benign, are associated with lower relationship quality. The practical tool here is simply this: when your partner shares something good that happened, stop what you are doing, make eye contact, ask questions, and express genuine positive engagement. This is a brief behavioral intervention with a disproportionately large effect on how connected your partner feels to you. Let me also address the research on what happens to relationships during periods of high stress, because every long-term relationship will encounter significant stressors, whether from work, from health challenges, from financial pressure, from the demands of parenting, or from external events. Research shows that stress has a direct negative effect on relationship quality through several mechanisms. Stress activates the HPA axis, increasing cortisol and activating the sympathetic nervous system, which in turn reduces the threshold for perceiving threat in social interactions, reduces the capacity for empathy and perspective taking, and increases irritability and hostility. The spillover effect, which is the tendency for stress from outside the relationship to negatively affect behavior within it, is well documented and is one of the most common sources of relationship deterioration during challenging life periods. The people whose stress most reliably impairs their relationship behavior are those who are least aware of the spillover process because they experience their irritability as a response to their partner rather than as a carryover from external stress. The practical tools for managing stress spillover involve two things. First, self-awareness and communication. Being aware that you are under external stress and communicating this to your partner, I am feeling overwhelmed at work this week and I might be less patient than usual, allows your partner to correctly attribute any irritability to the stressor rather than to relationship dissatisfaction, which prevents unnecessary conflict escalation. Second, co-regulation. Research on the psychobiology of stress response shows that physical proximity to a trusted partner directly reduces cortisol levels and dampens sympathetic activation. Partners who develop the habit of physical closeness, whether through brief touch, sitting together, or longer physical contact, during stressful periods, provide each other with a direct biological stress buffer that independent stress management techniques cannot fully replicate. I also want to say something about the role of individual psychological health in relationship quality, because the research is clear on this, and I think it needs to be stated directly. Romantic relationships cannot substitute for individual psychological work. People who carry significant unresolved trauma, who struggle with depression, anxiety, or other mental health challenges, who have not developed basic skills for emotional regulation and self-care, will find that those individual vulnerabilities get expressed within the relationship in ways that burden the partnership beyond what the partnership can absorb. This is not a criticism. It is a recognition that the relationship functions best as an environment in which two psychologically relatively whole people choose to build something together rather than as a primary context for individual healing. Therapy, whether individual or couples focused, is one of the most well-supported interventions for both individual mental health and relationship quality. The stigma that still attaches to therapy in some communities and contexts is genuinely costly in terms of relationship outcomes. And I want to name it directly because I think the data on therapeutic outcomes is clear enough to warrant encouragement. Finally, I want to address the question of when to end a relationship, because the science has something to say about this too, and it is often not discussed in the context of relationship health. The research identifies several indicators that, individually or in combination, strongly predict relationship failure despite intervention and that warrant serious consideration of whether the relationship serves both partners. These include the presence of any form of abuse, physical, emotional, sexual, or financial, which the research shows does not improve with time and does not respond meaningfully to the relationship tools we have discussed without the abusive partner undertaking specific individual work. Contempt that is pervasive and long-standing and that does not respond to efforts to build a culture of appreciation. Fundamental value incompatibility in domains that neither partner is willing to accommodate. And chronic emotional unavailability in one or both partners that does not change in response to repeated good faith efforts to address it. The decision to end a relationship is one of the most significant and painful decisions people make, and I do not want to minimize its difficulty. But the research also shows that people significantly overestimate how much of their life satisfaction depends on any specific relationship and underestimate their capacity to rebuild and thrive after a relationship ends. The sunk cost fallacy, the tendency to continue investing in something because of what you have already invested rather than because of its future prospects, is as real in romantic relationships as in financial decisions. And the greatest damage to a person's long-term relational capacity often comes not from the difficulty of leaving a relationship that is not working, but from the years spent in one that cannot work, which can erode self-esteem, reinforce negative relational patterns, and delay the development of the skills and self-knowledge that support genuinely healthy partnership. The science of attraction, compatibility, and romantic relationships does not reduce love to a formula, but it does illuminate the patterns and mechanisms that distinguish relationships that flourish over decades from those that fail. And it does identify specific behaviors that are within your control and that have disproportionate effects on relational quality. My hope is that you leave today's episode with a clearer picture of what the research actually shows and with a few concrete practices that you can begin applying immediately, whether you are in a relationship now, looking for one, or rebuilding after one has ended. Thank you for your time, and as always, thank you for your interest in science.